She was 8 years old, standing in her father's yard on a November morning in Ohio, watching him press his palm flat against the warm side of a bread oven. The brick dust smelled like rain on a hot road. Frost whitened the grass around his boots, but the wall under his hand held the heat from a fire that had burned out hours ago. He looked at her and said something she carried for 20 years without understanding it. A quick fire is only a match unless something heavier catches it. Now she understood. She was standing in a Kansas barn with two children, no wood, no money, and winter 6 weeks away. In September of 1885, Lydia Bell Wetherill was 28 years old, a widow of 11 days, and the owner of nothing that could keep her children alive through winter. Her husband Amos had died the way most men died on the Kansas plain, not from disease or gunfire, but from a moment of stupidity near a frightened animal. He had been hauling fence posts for his father's cattle concern. A mule kicked him in the chest. He walked 30 yards, sat down on a limestone slab, and stopped breathing. Lydia learned about it from a boy on a dun horse who could not look her in the eye. She had two children. Ruth was 7, quiet in a way that meant she was always watching. Milo was 4 and had a cough that came back every autumn like a creditor. Lydia could sew a straight seam, tally accounts without losing a digit, read weather from the way cattle bunched, and repair harness leather with an awl and linen thread. She had never built anything heavier than a wash-house hearth. She had never wintered alone. She had never buried a husband, and she had not yet learned how little grief mattered to the people who controlled her future. Amos's parents arrived 3 days after the funeral. Judson Wetherill was 57, thick through the shoulders, with a black coat that never carried dust because he never touched anything that might leave a mark. He owned cattle shares in 2 counties, town lots in Hayes, and enough credit influence to make a storekeeper sweat. His wife, Almeda, stood behind him the way a second signature stands behind the first, present, required, silent. They had never approved of Lydia. She was Ohio-born, a Trigg, daughter of a man who built bread ovens and died owing rent. Amos had married her against advice, moved west against advice, and failed at cattle bookkeeping against no one's surprise. Now Amos was dead and the debts remained. Judson laid it out in the front room of the house Lydia would lose within the week. Amos owed his father $43.12. Feed money, seed money. The doctor who had looked at Milo's chest in the spring and prescribed air that did not exist in Kansas. Judson had the notes. He spread them on the table the way a man spreads a hand of cards when he knows he has won. Lydia had $11.80. 2 sacks of cornmeal, 7 pounds of dried beans, a quilt her mother had pieced before Lydia left Ohio, a hand saw with 3 bent teeth. Judson did not ask for the money. He offered a solution. He would deed her a 40-acre tract north of Hayes, on the stony edge where his cattle range met open prairie. On it stood a barn. He called it her widow's portion. He said it with the careful pronunciation of a man who had practiced the phrase until it sounded generous. Almeda slid the deed across the table in the Hayes land office 2 days later. The deputy clerk dipped his pen twice because the ink was freezing thick in the well. Ruth pressed close to Lydia's hip. Milo coughed into the shawl Lydia had wrapped around his chest. Coal smoke from the office stove hung at eye level because the flue draw was poor. Almeda said, "There, shelter enough, if she is as stubborn as she claims." The brass seal went into the paper with a sound like a tooth cracking. The barn stood 16 feet wide and 30 feet long. The roof sagged along the ridge beam where a support post had shifted. 3 wall boards were missing on the north side, leaving gaps wide enough to push a fist through. The dirt floor turned slick after any rain. The loft ladder had 5 sound rungs and 2 that would break under a child's weight. In the southeast corner sat an iron stove with a crack through the firebox that ran from the loading door to the flue collar. Someone had tried to patch it with stove cement that had already split away. Lydia stood inside with both children and looked at the place where they would either live or die. She did not see it through description. She saw it through math. 3 missing wallboards meant wind. Wind meant heat loss. Heat loss meant fuel. Fuel meant wood. Wood meant timber. Timber meant the Smoky Hill Bottoms, 14 miles south where cottonwood and elm grew along the creek. 14 miles meant a team and wagon she did not own. Hiring a team cost money she did not have. Buying cordwood at the railhead cost $4 a cord, and she needed 6 cords minimum to hold a structure this leaky through a Kansas winter. 6 times 4 was $24. She had $11.80. Coal was available in Hayes. Coal cost more than cordwood per heating hour for a cracked stove that leaked half its heat through the firebox split. She could not afford coal either. She could burn twisted hay. Every poor settler on the treeless plain knew that trick. You took prairie grass, twisted it into tight ropes, and fed it into the stove. It burned hot and fast and was gone in minutes. To keep a room warm through a winter night, you needed someone feeding twists every 20 minutes. Lydia was one woman with 2 children. She could not stay awake from October to March. She could burn cow chips and dried manure. Better than grass, slower, steadier. But the nearest cattle had been Judson's, and he had moved the herd south for winter graze. The buffalo had been gone for a decade. The chips that remained on the open ground were old, powdery, half-rotted, and scattered across miles of prairie. She would have to walk with a sack on her back while 2 children waited in a barn that was not warm enough to wait in. The math circled back to the same answer. She could not heat the barn. Ezra P. Tillman arrived on the 4th day. He was 62, former freighter on the Smoky Hill Trail, current road overseer for the county. He had a white beard cut short enough to stay out of his collar and hands that looked like they had been carved from the same limestone that broke plows in western Kansas. He was not cruel. He had seen 11 winters on the high plains, and he had seen what happened to people who entered winter unprepared. He had helped carry 2 of them out of their houses in the spring. He did not knock. The barn did not have a door that closed properly. He pushed the hanging board aside, stepped in, and looked around with the slow attention of a man reading a death sentence. He walked the south wall. He pressed his thumb against the base of the stone pier where the mortar had crumbled. He looked at the stove and did not touch it because he could see the crack from 6 feet away. He climbed the loft ladder, tested each rung, came back down, and looked at the pile of scrap lumber stacked against the east wall. Pieces of old fence rail, a broken gate, half a shipping crate stamped with a Kansas City address. Then he looked at Lydia. "You have shelter that leaks," Ezra said, "a stove that smokes, and no timber within a day's good haul." Lydia said she knew. "A woman with 2 children needs 6 cords stacked before November. You have less than half a cord of splintered scrap." Lydia said she could burn grass twists and chips. Ezra cut her off before she finished the sentence. "Grass heats a kettle. It does not hold a room. I have buried people who believed grass would hold a room. The ones who died in December were the lucky ones. The ones who died in February died slow." He was not trying to frighten her. He was trying to make her leave. In his experience, the kind thing was to say the hard number early enough that pride could still bend. "You have time to sell the deed," Ezra said. "The land is not worth much, but it is worth a rail ticket east and a month's boarding. You take the children somewhere with timber and kin, and you come back when you can come back right." Lydia asked where she would go. Her father was dead. Her mother was dead. Her sister had married a man in Indiana who had written once in 3 years. She had no kin who could take 2 children and a woman with $11. Then the in-laws, Ezra said. The in-laws gave me this barn, Lydia said. Ezra looked at the cracked stove, the sagging roof, the gaps in the north wall where the October wind was already pressing through. He understood what she meant. The barn was not charity. It was a verdict dressed as generosity. The Wetherells had given her a place that looked like help on a deed, but felt like a dare. Survive or surrender. Either way, the children come back to us. Ezra left without promising to return. At the gap in the wall that served as a door, he stopped. I'm not your enemy, he said. Winter is. Lydia spent the next week doing what she could with what she had. She patched the north wall gaps with sod cut from the yard, packed tight and sealed with mud that would crack within a month but might slow the drafts until she had a better answer. She straightened 2 of the 3 bent teeth on the handsaw and cut the scrap lumber into stove lengths, stacking them against the south wall where they would stay dry. She rationed the cornmeal into portions that would last 6 weeks if the children did not grow and she did not eat much. She mended the loft ladder with a rung cut from the shipping crate. Ruth helped without being asked. She carried sod. She stacked kindling in order of size, the way Lydia had taught her. She did not ask when they were going home because she understood, in the way 7-year-olds understand without being told, that the word had changed its meaning. Milo coughed. On the 9th night, a cold rain came through from the northwest. It was not winter rain, not yet. It was the kind of October rain that reminds the body what is coming. A rehearsal, the sky saying, this, but worse, and soon. Lydia woke in the dark to a sound outside the barn. Not wind, not rain on the roof. A high, thin squealing like a hinge pulled past its limit. She took the lantern and found a pig. It was a shote, maybe 5 months old, gaunt through the ribs, mud-caked with 1 black spot near its left ear, and the kind of desperate energy that said it had been running from something for days. A stray dog had it cornered against the barn stone foundation, and the pig was screaming in the voice pigs use when they believe they are about to die. Lydia threw a chunk of limestone at the dog. It yelped and ran. The pig collapsed against the foundation, shaking. Ruth appeared at the barn gap in her night shift. She looked at the pig. She said, "His ear has a button." So he was Button. Lydia could not afford a pig. She could barely afford herself. A pig ate food she did not have. A pig needed shelter she could not spare. A pig was sentiment in a season when sentiment was a luxury measured in calories. She kept him alive anyway. Peelings from the last of the potatoes, spoiled corn from the bottom of a sack she had found wedged under the barn floor, water from the same bucket the children drank from. She told herself the pig was meat for December. She told herself she was being practical. She was not being practical. She was being human, and out here that was almost the same thing as being foolish. Yannersai, a week after Ezra's warning, Lydia was hoeing a drainage trench behind the barn to keep rainwater from pooling against the foundation and turning the dirt floor to mud. Button followed her everywhere now, the way pigs follow the person who feeds them, which is to say with absolute loyalty rooted in absolute self-interest. She had driven the hoe into hard ground a dozen times when Button began acting strange. He pushed past her legs, shoved his snout into the trench she had just opened, and began rooting with the kind of fury pigs reserve for something they believe is edible and buried. Lydia thought worms. She pulled him back. He returned. She pulled him back again. He squealed and bit the hoe handle. She let him dig. Under the red surface crust, 6 inches, maybe 8, Button opened a layer of clay that Lydia had never seen before. It was not the gray-brown river clay she knew from Ohio. It was pale, almost white where it was clean, dense enough that the hoe cut it in slabs rather than crumbling it, and when she picked up a fist-sized lump and squeezed, it held the shape of her fingers without cracking. She rolled a piece between her palms. It did not flake. She set a lump near the stove coals that evening and checked it in the morning. It was hard, not powder hard like dried river mud that a boot could crush, hard the way a piece of broken crockery is hard. Ring hard. And then something came back to her. She was 8 years old and standing in her father's yard in eastern Ohio, watching him work the bread oven he had built for a German baker on the Muskingum Road. It was November. The first hard frost had come early that year, and the baker was worried about his dough rising in the cold room beside the oven. Lydia's father had heated flat stones around the oven's base during the day's baking, then carried them inside the rising room and set them on the floor. She remembered the weight of the stones. She remembered the way the heat came off them slow and even, not like a fire that leaps and falls, but like a breath held steady. She remembered her father's hand flat on the warm stone wall, and the thing he had said that she had carried without knowing why. A quick fire is only a match unless something heavier catches it. She had not understood. She was 8. Now she was 28, holding pale Kansas clay that rang when she tapped it, and the understanding arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a heat in her chest that had nothing to do with the stove. The fire was not the warmth. The wall was. She did not know the word refractory. She did not know that the clay beneath her barn sat in the Dakota Formation, a geological layer that held some of the best fire-resistant clays on the Central Plains. She did not know that brickmakers in eastern Kansas had already identified this type of clay as capable of withstanding temperatures that would crack common brick. She knew only that this clay was different. It held heat the way a stone wall held heat. And if she could shape it, dry it, and build it into something massive enough, something that could absorb the heat from a fast fire and release it slowly, the way her father's stones had warmed the baker's rising room, then maybe, she did not need 6 cords of wood. Maybe she needed a different kind of fire and a different kind of wall. The idea was not invention. It was memory meeting desperation. She began testing. She made 4 tiles, each the size of her palm. The first was raw clay, nothing added. The second was clay mixed with a handful of sand from the creek bed. The third was clay mixed with chopped straw. The fourth was clay mixed with crushed fragments from the broken iron stove's old fire brick base, pieces she had swept out when cleaning the firebox. She laid them on a flat rock beside a shallow fire pit and burned a stack of hay twists over them for 2 hours. Then she let them cool overnight. The raw clay tile had a hairline crack through the center. The sand tile crumbled at the edges when she pressed it. The straw tile had split in half. The straw had burned away and left voids that weakened the whole piece. The crushed brick tile was whole, dense. When she tapped it with the hoe blade, it rang. She did not know the word grog. She did not know that adding pre-fired material to raw clay was a technique older than written language, used by potters and brickmakers across centuries to control shrinkage and improve fired strength. She knew that the tile with the old brick dust had survived and the others had not. That was enough. Now she needed a design. She sketched it in the dirt beside the barn with a stick, a mass, not a stove, a wall. 5 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep, 7 feet high, built against the south stone pier where the barn's only solid masonry stood. A small firebox at the base, lined with the densest clay blocks she could make, sized for fast hot burns of twisted hay, manure blocks, and whatever scraps she could gather. Behind the firebox, the hot smoke would not go straight up. It would travel through channels, rising, turning. falling, turning again, before reaching a clay-lined chimney. Every turn would steal heat from the smoke and press it into the mass. By the time the smoke left the chimney, it would be cool. The heat would be in the wall. The design was not sophisticated. It was a guess built from a dead man's lesson and a pig's appetite. But the physics were sound even if Lydia could not name them. Mass absorbs energy. Dense mass releases it slowly. A 3,000-pound clay wall heated to 200 degrees would radiate warmth for hours after the fire died, if it worked. Nettie Basgall arrived on a Tuesday, carrying a jar of sour milk and looking for someone who could mend a torn skirt hem. She was 34, German-Russian, from a family that had settled near Munjor a decade earlier, when the Volga Germans came to Ellis County in waves, bringing wheat seed, dark bread recipes, and a talent for surviving on plains that other settlers abandoned. Nettie was practical the way a fence post is practical, planted straight, uninterested in decoration. She had 5 children, a husband who hauled freight when there was freight, and an understanding of hardship that made her generous in small ways and blunt in large ones. She saw the clay. Lydia had 200 pounds of it dug, cut into rough blocks, and drying on planks beside the barn's south wall. She had the test tiles lined up on a board. She had the dirt sketch of the heater design still visible near the foundation. And she had split knuckles and clay under every fingernail and a look on her face that Nettie recognized because she had seen it on her own mother's face in the first winter on the Volga steppe. The look of a woman who is either building something or losing her mind and cannot yet tell which. Nettie traded the sour milk for Lydia's promise to mend the skirt. Then she stood over the drying blocks and said what a practical woman says when she sees another woman stacking clay in October. "You cannot eat bricks?" Lydia said, "No, but maybe I can sleep beside them." Nettie's objections came in order of urgency. Wet clay cracks when heated too fast. Smoke in a closed barn kills faster than cold. Grass and manure burn too quick and too dirty to fire masonry properly. A chimney built wrong on a barn roof catches the whole structure, and then you have no shelter at all, not even a leaky one. Every objection was correct. Lydia did not argue. She showed the test tiles. She showed the crushed brick tile that had survived. She described the channel design, the logic of stealing heat from smoke before it reached the chimney. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have had no one to explain it to for weeks, and the words come out fast and tangled and desperate. Nettie listened the way she listened to everything, with her arms crossed and her head tilted, and her face giving nothing away until she had heard enough to judge. "And if the channels clog," Nettie said, "and the smoke comes back, and the children breathe it, then I will have killed them faster than the cold would have," Lydia said. "But the cold is certain. This is only dangerous." Nettie did not agree. She did not disagree. She picked up the crushed brick tile, weighed it in her hand, and set it back down. "Your father built ovens," she said. "Bread ovens," Lydia said. "Not heaters. Bread ovens hold heat. That is what I am hoping." Nettie left with the mended skirt and without a promise to return. Lydia watched her wagon shrink into the flat horizon and understood that she had not gained an ally. She had gained a witness. If this worked, Nettie would tell people she had seen it early. If it failed, Nettie would tell people she had warned her. Either way, someone would remember. The gossip reached Hayes within a week. A woman at the dry goods counter said Lydia Wetherill was stacking mud bricks in her barn like a child building a fort. A man outside the feed store said she was constructing a chimney bigger than the house. Another man, the one who hauled mail from the Ellis station, said the pig was digging the clay and the widow was following the pig's orders. And he laughed in the way men laugh when the joke confirms something they already believe about women alone. The word that traveled fastest was not mud or clay or chimney. The word was crazy. And in a settlement where crazy could mean a visit from the county, where a probate judge could remove children from a home he deemed unsafe, that word carried weight measured not in humor, but in law. Judson Wetherill heard it the way Judson heard everything, through the people who owed him favors, credit, and deference. He came to the barn on a Saturday, wearing the black coat that never carried dust. He did not touch the clay. He did not look at the test tiles. He did not ask Lydia what she was building or why. He stood in the center of the barn with his hands behind his back and looked at the children the way a man looks at livestock he expects to acquire. "You are making a spectacle of our name," Judson said. "It is my name now," Lydia said. The sentence landed in the barn like a stone dropped into still water. Judson's face changed, not to anger, which would have been simple, but to the harder expression of a man who realizes he has underestimated a problem. "The probate court meets in November," Judson said. "If I petition on grounds of neglect, and I have neighbors who will testify that you're keeping children in an unsafe structure, feeding them cornmeal and trading food for clay, the judge will not need long to decide." "Then petition," Lydia said. "I am trying to help you." "You gave me a barn with no stove and no wood and told me it was generosity. That is not help. That is a clock." Judson reached inside his coat and produced a folded paper. "A rail ticket, 3rd class, eastbound, 1 adult, 2 children. Take this," he said. "Leave the deed with my attorney. Go east. Get settled. When you are able, send for the children. I will keep them safe." Lydia looked at the ticket. She looked at Ruth, who was standing near the stone pier, with both hands pressed flat against the clay blocks, feeling the last of the day's heat leave them. She looked at Milo, asleep on the quilt with Button curled beside him, the pig's nose tucked under the boy's arm. "If I leave," Lydia said, "I do not come back. You know that. The ticket is one way. The children stay. The land stays. And you wait for the clay to matter." Judson put the ticket back in his coat. He said nothing else. He left the way he had come, without touching anything, without leaving a mark, without allowing the dust of the barn to settle on the black wool of his certainty that time was on his side. The storekeeper refused Lydia credit the following Monday. A churchwoman approached her after the Wednesday service and offered to take Milo. "Just until spring, just until things are settled." The words were kind. The meaning was not. Nettie pulled back, not from cruelty, from caution. In a settlement where reputation traveled faster than weather, standing beside a woman the community had labeled unstable was a risk Nettie could not afford with 5 children of her own. Lydia had 6 weeks until winter. She had a design scratched in dirt. She had clay that rang when she tapped it. She had a pig that slept beside her son. She had no allies, no credit, no safety margin, and a father-in-law building a legal case to take her children. And she had her father's voice in her head, steady as a warm stone. A quick fire is only a match unless something heavier catches it. She started molding blocks before dawn. The work broke her body in stages. The first week was digging. She cut the clay in slabs from the trench Button had opened, hauling each piece up on a board she used as a ramp. 50 pounds per trip, 20 trips a day. Her shoulders locked. Her back seized on the 3rd morning, and she worked through it because there was no one to dig if she stopped. She mixed each batch by hand in a wooden feed box, 2 parts clay, 1 part crushed old fire brick, a handful of sand. She kneaded it the way she had seen her father knead clay for oven bricks. Heel of the palm, fold, press, turn, fold, press, until the mix was even and the color uniform. Then she packed it into molds she had built from scrap lumber, blocks 6 inches by 4 inches by 10 inches, each weighing close to 9 pounds when wet. By the end of the first week, she had 200 blocks drying on planks in the October sun. They shrank as they dried. She had not accounted for shrinkage. 3 blocks cracked through the center, 8 others warped enough that they would not stack level. She remade the cracked ones. She noted which batches cracked and which held. She marked the planks with pencil, batch number, date, mix ratio, because her father had taught her that the difference between a builder and a fool was the fool threw away failures and the builder read them. The second week was foundation work. She dug down 18 inches to firm clay under the barn floor, directly against the south stone pier. She carried limestone scraps from a collapsed fence line 200 yards east and laid them flat across the bottom of the pit, tamping them level with a fence post used as a ram. Her arms shook by noon. She ate cold cornmeal mush standing in the trench, because sitting down meant she might not stand back up. Ruth brought water without being asked. She carried buckets that weighed almost as much as she did, and she did not spill. She was 7 years old, and she already understood that help meant doing the thing before someone had to ask for it. Milo watched from the quilt. His cough had quieted in the dry October air, but Lydia listened for it, the way a sailor listens for the change in wind, always, and beneath everything else. The first frost came on a Thursday night in the third week. Lydia woke to white grass and a skin of ice on the water bucket. She had 3 weeks, maybe 4, before real cold. The firebox was half built. The channels were lines in the dirt. The chimney was a plan, not a structure, and her hands had split at the knuckles from the clay and the cold and the work, and the splits would not close because she could not stop using her hands. She was behind. She was exactly where Ezra had said she would be, a woman with 2 children running out of time, building something no one believed in, bleeding into the mortar. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? What she did not know, as she packed clay into the firebox form with cracked hands and failing daylight, was that help was already closer than she imagined. 4 miles south, in the Volga German settlement near Schönchen, a 61-year-old widow named Attilia Rohr had heard about the crazy woman with the clay, and Attilia, unlike everyone else who had heard the story, was not laughing. She was listening. Attilia Rohr came on foot, which was the first thing Lydia noticed about her. In western Kansas, people who could ride did not walk. People who could drive did not ride. Walking 4 miles across open prairie meant either poverty or purpose, and Attilia moved with the particular steadiness of a woman who had chosen to come and would not be turned around by wind or opinion. She was 61, small through the frame but dense through the hands, the way women who have worked clay and dough and stone for decades become dense, not large, but weighted, as if gravity had negotiated a private arrangement with her bones. Her face was brown and creased along lines that ran from the corners of her eyes to her jaw, and her hair was white under a dark headscarf tied in the Volga German style, knotted beneath the chin. She spoke English with an accent that mixed German consonants with Russian vowel shapes, and when she was thinking, she muttered in a dialect that was neither language and both. She did not knock. She walked past the barn and went straight to the clay trench. Lydia found her there, standing at the edge, looking down at the pale exposed seam the way a doctor looks at an injury, not with alarm, but with assessment. She picked up a piece of raw clay, broke it, smelled the broken edge, rubbed the surface between her thumb and forefinger. She set it down and picked up another piece from a different depth. She did the same thing. Then she walked to the drying planks where Lydia's blocks were lined up in rows, each one marked with a pencil batch number. She picked up a block from the first batch. She picked up one from the fourth. She tapped them together and listened. Lydia stood 10 feet away, holding the hoe, not speaking, because she understood that this woman was reading her work the way Lydia's father had read brick, with her hands and ears before her mouth. Ottilia set the blocks down. She looked at the test tiles on the board. She looked at the one that had cracked, and the one that had crumbled, and the one that had split, and the one that had survived. She picked up the survivor tile, the one with crushed fire brick mixed in, and turned it over. "You did not throw away the ones that failed," Ottilia said. "My father said failures are notes," Lydia said. "Your father built ovens. Bread ovens." Ottilia looked at her for the first time with full attention. "My husband repaired stoves, masonry stoves. In Graf, on the Volga, before we came here. He built them, he tore them down, he rebuilt them. He said a stove is an argument between fire and stone, and the builder's job is to make sure stone wins." She set the tile down. "You blamed the brick," she said, "not the fire." "Good." Ottilia did not offer to help. She did not say she would teach. She came back the next morning at the same hour, walking the same 4 miles, and she stood at the clay trench and began working without asking permission. This was how she communicated decisions, through action, not announcement. The first thing she taught Lydia was selection. The clay seam was not uniform. Near the surface, under the red crust, the clay carried dark streaks of lignite, soft carbon that would burn out during firing, leaving voids that weakened the block. Deeper, past the first 18 inches, the clay turned paler and denser, almost chalky white when dry, with fewer dark inclusions. This was the clay they wanted. But even the good clay had variation. Ottilia showed Lydia how to test it with her hands. Cut a slab, bend it. If it cracked clean across, like a dry stick, it was too lean, too much sand, not enough plasticity. If it bent and tore, showing a ragged wet edge, it was too fat, too sticky, too likely to shrink and crack during drying. The best clay bent before it broke. It showed a clean curve and then a fracture that looked like a torn page, not a snapped bone. "Feel that," Ottilia said, pressing Lydia's fingertips along the fracture edge. "That is what you are building with. Not the color, not the smell, the break." They worked the trench together for 2 days, sorting clay into 3 piles: firebox grade, channel grade, and reject. The rejects went into a pile that Lydia would later grind for grog. Nothing was wasted. The second lesson was shrinkage. Ottilia had Lydia cut a strip of wet clay exactly 10 inches long and lay it on a dry board in the sun. They marked both ends with pencil lines. 2 days later, the strip measured 9.5 inches, nearly half an inch of shrinkage in 10. "Now measure your molds," Ottilia said. Lydia's molds produced blocks 6 inches by 4 inches by 10 inches when wet. After drying, those blocks would shrink to roughly 5 3/4 by 3 3/4 by 9.5. The difference meant nothing for a single block. It meant everything for a wall 7 feet high, where every course had to stack level, and every joint had to meet without gaps that would leak smoke into the room where her children slept. They rebuilt the molds. Ottilia cut the new dimensions with the handsaw, while Lydia re-kneaded a batch of clay that had dried too fast on its surface and cracked. The work was not elegant. It was mud and math, and 2 women arguing over fractions of an inch, while the October wind pushed through the barn wall and Milo coughed in the corner. "You will want to rush," Ottilia said. "You will think, the frost is coming, I must build faster, and you will build wrong, and the wall will crack, and the smoke will come into the room instead of going up the chimney, and then your children will breathe it." "I know," Lydia said. "You know it here," Ottilia said, and tapped her own forehead. "You do not know it here." She pressed her fist against her own sternum. When the frost comes, you will learn the difference. The third lesson was the flue path. Attilia emptied a sack of flour onto the barn's one flat board, the board Lydia had been using as a mixing surface, and drew the smoke channels with her finger. The drawing was simple: a firebox at the base, an opening at the top of the firebox into a rising channel, a turn at the top, a descending channel, another turn at the bottom, a second rising channel, and then the chimney exit. Every turn steals heat, Attilia said. The smoke goes in hot, comes out cool. Where did the heat go? Into the walls, Lydia said. Into the mass. The walls, the floor of the channels, the ceiling of the channels. Everything the smoke touches takes heat from it, but... She drew a line across the middle channel. Too many turns and the smoke does not move. It sits. It comes back into the room. Too few turns and the heat goes up the chimney and you have warmed the sky. How many turns? For this size, with this clay, with grass and manure fuel that burns fast and dirty, 2 full reversals. No more. And the chimney must draw well, or the first reversal will push smoke backward the moment the wind shifts outside. They built a model. Attilia had Lydia stack broken bricks and clay scraps into a small replica no taller than a man's knee beside the barn's east wall. They sealed the joints with mud, shaped a tiny firebox, built 2 turns, and added a short chimney made from a tin can with both ends cut away. They lit a twist of prairie grass inside the firebox. The smoke hesitated. It curled upward, hit the first turn, paused, and then pulled. It traveled through the first descending channel, turned at the bottom, rose through the second channel, and exited the tin chimney in a thin gray stream. Attilia held her palm near the side of the model. After 10 minutes, the clay scraps were warm. That, Attilia said, but bigger, much bigger, and if you build it wrong, it is not warm clay. It is a barn full of smoke with 2 children inside. Lydia stared at the thin stream leaving the chimney. The heat was in the wall. Her father had known. This woman's husband had known. The Volga Germans who built masonry stoves in Russian villages had known. The knowledge was not new. It was old, and it had traveled 6,000 miles across steppe and ocean and prairie to arrive at this moment in a Kansas barn because a pig had found the clay. The work entered its brutal middle. Week 3. The firebox took shape. Lydia and Attilia laid the densest blocks in double courses, fitting each one by hand, trimming edges with the hoe blade, packing joints with clay slip mixed from reject clay and water. The firebox opening was 12 inches wide and 10 inches tall, large enough for a bundle of hay twists or a manure block, small enough to control the burn. Behind the firebox, they left the opening into the first rising channel, 8 inches by 6 inches, angled slightly upward so the draft would pull naturally. Lydia's hands were past cracking now. The skin at her knuckles had split and resplit until the wound stayed open, weeping clear fluid that the clay turned gray. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her spare dress. The strips were wet by noon and stiff by evening, and she replaced them each morning with new strips until the dress hem was gone, and she tore the bottom of a flour sack instead. Ruth kept tally marks on a board, blocks laid per day, blocks cracked and replaced, days remaining until what Lydia called the line, the date by which the heater had to be finished or the cold would overtake the construction. Lydia had set the line at November 15th. Optimistic, reckless possibly, but a deadline without teeth was no deadline at all. Week 4, the first channel and its reversal turn were complete. The chimney throat, the passage from the upper channel into the chimney column, was the hardest piece. It had to narrow enough to maintain velocity in the smoke, but not so narrow that ash buildup would choke it. Ottilia shaped it with her hands while Lydia held the form board steady, and they argued about the angle for 20 minutes while the wind pushed grit through the barn wall, and Button slept beneath the work platform with his chin on Lydia's boot. First frost had whitened the grass 2 weeks earlier. Now the ground was hard before noon. Lydia had $6 left. The cornmeal was down to 1 sack. The beans were gone. Ruth had started eating the peelings that Lydia had been feeding Button, and Lydia had not said anything because she could not afford to feed either of them more and could not bear to take food from one to give to the other. Milo's cough had quieted in the dry October air, but returned with the November damp. It sat in his chest like a tenant that would not leave, sometimes silent for hours, then shaking him awake at midnight with a sound like tearing cloth. Lydia pressed her ear to his back the way Ottilia had shown her and listened for the wet rattle that meant something worse. She did not hear it, not yet. Week 5. The upper chamber was finished. The heater stood 7 feet tall against the south stone pier, 5 feet wide, 2.5 feet deep. It was not beautiful. The blocks were uneven in color, pale gray where the clay was purest, dark where lignite traces remained, tan where the grog concentration was highest. The joints were thick in some courses, thin in others. The chimney rose through a hole Lydia had cut in the roof and lined with clay bricks mortared to a piece of salvaged stovepipe. It looked like what it was, a massive clay wall built by 2 women with hand tools and no money. It looked crude and heavy and slightly crooked where the 3rd course had settled before the mortar set. It also looked to anyone who understood masonry like something that might work. Week 6. The heater stood. But standing was not the same as ready. The mass was still damp. Moisture trapped inside the clay, heated too fast, could flash to steam, and steam inside dense masonry generates pressure that cracks the structure from inside. Ottilia knew this the way she knew her own breathing, not from books, but from watching her husband rebuild stoves that impatient owners had ruined by lighting full fires in wet masonry. Small fires, Ottilia said. 3 days of small fires, a handful of grass, no more. The heat must walk into the clay, not run. Lydia looked at the frost on the grass. She looked at Milo's thin face. 3 days, she said. Would you rather 3 days of patience or a wall cracked through the firebox with smoke in your children's lungs? Lydia built small fires. Tiny fires. Fires so modest that Ruth asked if the heater was broken. Wisps of grass, a few chips, a single manure block broken into quarters and burned 1 quarter at a time. The smoke pulled through the channels. The chimney drew. The mass warmed so slowly that Lydia could not feel the difference with her palm for the first 12 hours. On the 2nd day, Ottilia tapped the outside of the heater with a spoon handle, listening. She tapped the firebox lintel. She tapped the first channel wall. She tapped the chimney throat. Here, she said, and pointed to a joint in the upper chamber where a thin crack had opened, a seam no wider than a hair, running along the mortar line between the 3rd and 4th courses from the top. Lydia's stomach dropped. Cut it out, Ottilia said. Repack it with slip and crushed fired fragments, and do not look at me like the world has ended. Clay talks. You must listen. Nettie returned on the 2nd morning of the curing fires. She came with her oldest son, a boy of 14 who was strong enough to lift a feed sack and quiet enough to work without being told twice. And she came with a wagon carrying a load that surprised Lydia into silence. 40 dried manure and straw fuel blocks, each the size of a bread loaf, stacked and covered with a canvas against the frost. I still think smoke will kill you, Nettie said. But if it does not, you will need something to burn. It was not friendship. It was not charity. It was a bet. A practical woman hedging against the possibility that the crazy widow might be right, and if she was right, Nettie wanted to have been the one who helped when help was scarce. Nettie's son carried the fuel blocks inside and stacked them against the east wall. Then he stood looking at the heater with the expression of a boy trying to understand something too large for his experience. "Will it get hot?" he asked. "Not hot," Lydia said. "Warm. For a long time." The first real test was deliberate. Ottilia chose the fuel, 2 handfuls of sunflower stalk, 1 tightly twisted grass rope, 1 manure straw block. She lit the fire herself, crouching at the firebox opening with a sulfur match and a strip of bark for kindling. The fire caught. It burned fast and bright. Grass fuel always did, a surge of heat that peaked in minutes and collapsed. But the design was not built for the peak. It was built for what happened after. Smoke pulled into the first channel. Lydia pressed her face to the clean-out gap at the base and watched. The smoke was moving, not stalling. It traveled up, hit the first turn, hesitated for a heartbeat that stopped Lydia's own heart, and then pulled downward through the descending channel. At the second turn it rose again, faster now, drawn by the chimney's pull. 1 hour after the fire died, Lydia pressed her palm to the side wall of the heater. Warm, not hot. Warm the way a body is warm, gentle, steady, present. The children smiled. Ottilia did not smile. She tapped the upper seam she had made Lydia repair, listening for the hollow sound of separation. Solid. She pressed her ear to the chimney throat and listened for the whistle that meant a blockage forming. Nothing. She stood back and looked at the heater with an expression that was not satisfaction, but something closer to suspicion, the expression of a woman who had seen too many first tests go well and second tests go wrong. "Keep firing small," she said. "Twice a day. Let the mass learn the heat." They tested for 3 more days. Outside temperature near 15 degrees. The barn corner near the heater held 42 degrees until midnight after the evening burn. The far north wall, where the gaps let wind through despite Lydia's sod patches, dropped below freezing. The children slept within 6 feet of the heater on the quilt and a straw pallet Nettie had brought. It was not victory. It was a map. The heater worked on its south side. But the barn was not a sealed room. It was a leaky shell, and heat escaped through every crack and gap the wind could find. New work. Lydia hung quilts and feed sacks as interior curtains, creating a smaller space around the heater, a room within the room. She stacked loose clay blocks along the base of the north wall and stuffed the gaps above them with twisted grass plastered over with mud. She built a low clay bench beside the heater, an extension of the mass warmed by contact, where the children could sit during the day. Ezra returned. He stood inside the curtained space and placed his hand on the heater wall. He held it there for a long time. Then he removed it and looked at Lydia. "The smoke draws better than I expected," he said. "But," Lydia said, "a warm corner is not a winter. This gives you December, maybe January if it stays mild. A real storm will find every crack in this barn and pull the heat out faster than that wall can give it back. Then I will seal the cracks. You have sealed them with mud and grass. Mud cracks. Grass rots. A wind from the north at 30 miles in a storm will push through those patches like they are paper. Then I will seal them again." Ezra shook his head, not in anger, in the slow sadness of a man who has been right too many times about things he wished he were wrong about. "I hope it holds," he said. "I do." He left. Lydia stood in the curtained corner with her hand on the warm clay and listened to the wind rising outside and understood that Ezra was not wrong. He was incomplete. He knew what the wind could do. He did not know what the clay could hold. Neither entirely did she. That was the truth she lived inside as November became December and December darkened toward the shortest day. The heater worked. It worked better each week as the mass dried deeper and the clay grew denser and the heat stayed longer after each burn. She learned the rhythm, a fast, hot fire of grass and manure, 15 to 20 minutes, twice a day. Close the damper halfway after the coals died to slow the draft. Never close it fully. Attilia had warned that a sealed damper with live coals could push invisible, odorless gas back into the room and kill in silence. The children grew accustomed to the warmth. Ruth pressed her palms to the clay wall every morning and reported the temperature by feel. Still warm, or cooler today, or the bottom is warmer than the top. Milo slept on the clay bench and his cough quieted in the dry, even heat. Button slept beneath the bench, nose tucked under his belly, radiating the small furnace of a pig's body into the air beneath Milo's bed. But the real winter had not come. The cattle outside Hayes bunched with their tails to the north. Telegraph talk at the station mentioned storms building west of Dodge City. A traveling man at the dry goods store said the barometer at Fort Larned had dropped faster than anyone could remember. The air turned yellow-gray before sunset, the color Kansas old-timers called blizzard gold. Attilia came to the barn and did not leave. She brought a sack of dried bread, a jar of rendered lard, and her husband's stove trowel, the small flat blade he had used to smooth mortar in flue joints. She set the trowel on the shelf beside Lydia's test tiles and said, "If the storm breaks it, we will need that to repair it." She did not say if we survive. She did not need to. The word lived in the space between every sentence either of them spoke. The blizzard hit on a January night with the sound of something tearing, not wind. Wind was familiar. This was different. A roar that came from the north and kept coming, a wall of sound that did not gust and ebb but pressed continuous and rising against the barn's north face, like a hand pushing a door that would not close. Snow did not fall. Snow drove. It came horizontal, fine as sand, and it found every gap Lydia had sealed and pushed through in white needles that melted on the floor and froze again within minutes. Lydia woke to Button screaming under the lean-to she had built against the barn's east wall for the pig and the last of the fuel. The lean-to was shaking. She could hear boards separating from nails with a sound like knuckles cracking. She pulled on boots, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and forced the barn door open against a drift that had already piled knee-high. The air hit her face like a slap delivered with an open hand made of ice. She could not see the lean-to. She could not see anything. The world had become white noise rendered as weather. She found Button by sound. He was wedged between the fuel stack and the barn foundation, squealing in the pitch that meant death was close enough to smell. She grabbed him by the hind legs and dragged him into the barn. He weighed close to 80 pounds now, and he fought her the entire way, not because he wanted to stay outside, but because terror had replaced thought. Inside, she dropped the bar across the door and stood panting. Ruth was awake, sitting on the straw pallet with Milo pulled into her lap. Milo was coughing, not the dry bark of autumn, but a new sound, wet and fast, that Lydia heard and catalogued and filed under the heading of things she could not afford to think about until the immediate danger was addressed. Attilia was already at the heater. She had loaded the firebox with a full manure straw block and a bundle of sunflower stalks and lit them before Lydia had reached the door. The fire caught and roared in the small chamber, and the smoke pulled hard through the channels. The chimney draw was fierce in this wind, almost too fierce, sucking air through the firebox at a rate that consumed fuel faster than calm weather burns. Smaller charges, Ottilia said. More often. The wind will pull everything out if you feed it big. Lydia broke a manure block in half and set the other half aside. She counted the fuel. 7 hay twists. 4 manure straw blocks, now 3.5. A bundle of sunflower stalks. A pile of dried chips Nettie had brought. Enough for how long? She did the math. If she burned a small charge every 3 to 4 hours, she had fuel for 36 hours, maybe 40 if she stretched it. The storm could last a day. It could last 3. The first complication found them by midnight. The wind tore a roof board loose above the north side of the barn, the cold side, away from the heater, the side Lydia had sealed with sod and mud and grass. The board lifted and banged and finally ripped away, and snow poured through the gap in a steady stream that built a drift on the barn floor within an hour. Lydia had to choose. Climb the loft, reach the roof gap, and try to nail a patch in place, pucker in darkness, in a blizzard, on a roof that sagged, or stay below and tend the heater and the children and let the snow invade. She climbed. Ruth held the lantern at the base of the loft ladder. Lydia carried a board, 3 nails held in her teeth, and the hammer. The loft was an open platform with no railing, and the wind through the roof gap hit her like a living thing that wanted her on the ground. She could feel the barn shudder beneath her. She hammered the board across the gap, missed the nail twice because her hands were shaking, caught it on the 3rd swing, and drove it home. The patch was crude. It would hold until it did not. She climbed down and nearly fell on the last rung because her fingers had gone numb. Milo was worse. His cough had turned constant, a rhythmic, wet tearing that shook his whole body. Lydia pressed her ear to his back. She heard the rattle, the sound she had been listening for and dreading, the sound that meant fluid where air should be. His forehead was hot. His lips were pale, except where coughing had turned them red. She moved him to the clay bench, as close to the heater as she could place him without risk of burn. She hung a damp cloth over his face to ease his breathing and fed the firebox a half charge of grass and chips. The heater wall was warm against her palm. She needed it to stay warm. She needed the air around her son to stay warm because cold air in damaged lungs was a killer more patient and more thorough than any blizzard. Ottilia sat on the cot against the south wall, her bad hip locked from the cold and the damp. She could not rise without help, but her voice carried across the small curtained space. "Do not close the damper until the coals are fully dead," Ottilia said. "I know you want to hold the heat, but live coals with a closed damper will send poison into this room, and you will not smell it, and in the morning no one in this barn will be breathing." "I know," Lydia said. "Say it back to me." "Damper stays cracked until coals are ash, not embers. Ash." "Good." The second night was the worst. The wind did not stop. The temperature, as near as Lydia could gauge from the behavior of water and breath and exposed skin, was somewhere below 0 and still falling. The water bucket near the north wall had frozen solid. The water bucket near the heater bench had a skin of ice on top, but liquid beneath. That difference, frozen solid versus frozen surface, was the distance between the heater's reach and the winter's grip, and it was measured in feet. 8 feet from the heater, you lived. 12 feet from the heater, the water froze. If you are invested in this story, hit subscribe and stay with us, because what happens next changes everything. Someone pounded on the barn door. Not Judson. The rhythm was wrong, frantic, open-handed slapping rather than the deliberate knock of a man who expected doors to open for him. Lydia lifted the bar. Ezra Tillman fell through the opening with frost in his beard and a boy under his arm. The boy was Nettie's oldest, the 14-year-old who had carried fuel blocks into the barn weeks earlier. He had been crossing from the well to the house when the wind took his sense of direction. He had walked the wrong way for 50 yards before Ezra, crawling along a fence line between his own shelter and Nettie's, had found him face down in a drift. The boy's hands were white. His lips were blue. He was conscious, but not speaking. Ezra laid him on the straw pallet beside the heater. Lydia stripped the boy's wet gloves and wrapped his hands in dry cloth. She did not rub them. Ottilia had told her, "Never rub frozen flesh. It tears the damaged skin beneath." "How long was he out?" Lydia asked. "Long enough," Ezra said. His own face was gray. His breathing was shallow and fast. He sat against the heater wall and closed his eyes, and for a moment Lydia thought he had died sitting up. Then he opened his eyes and looked at the clay face beside him, the massive, crude, uneven wall radiating heat into his back. "Kramer's shanty lost the stovepipe," Ezra said. "The joint where it goes through the roof. Wind took it. His wife and the two youngest were in the root cellar last I heard. Kramer was trying to reach the cattle." "In this?" "He has rope strung from the door to the barn. If the rope holds." "And if it does not?" Ezra said nothing. In blizzard conditions on open prairie, a man who lost his guideline could become lost 10 yards from his own door. The historical record was full of bodies found in spring, within sight of the house they had been trying to reach. Lydia fed the heater, a half block of manure, a twist of grass, a handful of chips. The fire caught and roared for 12 minutes and died to coals. She cracked the damper and waited. The heat entered the channels. She pressed her palm to the side wall. Warm, still warm, the mass was holding. But for how long? She counted fuel again. She had burned through a third of her supply in the first 18 hours. If the storm lasted another 36 hours, she would run out. She began breaking the remaining manure blocks into smaller pieces, stretching each charge thinner, gambling that the mass held enough stored heat between firings to keep the air above freezing even as the charges shrank. At 3 a.m. of the second night, the upper seam of the heater began ticking. Lydia heard it from the pallet where she had been dozing, a sharp, rhythmic sound like a fingernail tapping on fired clay. Tick, tick, tick. Her body flooded with the cold that has nothing to do with temperature. She was on her feet before she fully woke, pressing her hands to the upper wall, feeling for the crack, feeling for the shift that would mean the mass was splitting. "Ottilia," she said. Ottilia was awake. She had been awake for hours, lying on the cot with her eyes open, listening to the same sound. "Put your hand flat on it," Ottilia said. "Both hands. Is it moving?" Lydia pressed both palms to the upper wall. The clay was warm. It was not shifting. It was not separating. The ticking continued, steady and rhythmic, like the heartbeat of something very large and very patient. "It is expansion," Ottilia said. "The mass is warming deeper than before. The inner clay is swelling as it heats. If the sound changes, if it becomes a grinding, or if you feel movement, or if smoke appears at the seam, then it is cracking and we have a problem. Tick is talk. Grind is danger." Lydia stood with her palms on the wall and listened. Tick, 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 steady, even. The clay warming deeper into its own body, stretching at the pace of heat moving through dense material. No smoke appeared. No grinding came. The heater held. Dawn of the third day came gray and quieter. The wind had not stopped, but it had dropped from a roar to a moan. Snow still fell, but the horizontal drive had eased. Lydia could see the outline of the lean-to through the barn gap. It was still standing, barely, leaning 20 degrees off plumb. Milo's fever broke sometime before first light. Lydia found him soaked in sweat on the clay bench, the heat from the mass beneath him steady as a held hand. His cough was still there. It would be there for weeks, but the wet rattle in his chest had loosened. He opened his eyes and asked for water. Lydia chipped ice from the north wall bucket and melted it in a cup held against the heater face. Nettie's boy could move his fingers. The tips were blackened on the right hand. 2 of them would stay that way, but the damage had stopped at the first knuckle. He would lose sensation, but not the fingers themselves. He sat against the heater wall and stared at it with the expression of someone who does not understand why he is alive, but suspects the answer is somewhere in the warm clay at his back. Ezra had not moved from his spot against the heater. He had slept sitting up, his back against the mass, his hands folded in his lap. When Lydia woke him, he looked at the clay face beside him, the way a man looks at a wall he has been wrong about. Button lay under the clay bench, nose tucked beneath his belly. The animal that had found the seam now warmed by it. The pig that had been a sentimentality she could not afford had become the accident that started everything, sleeping in the heat his own rooting had uncovered. Lydia burned her last fuel that morning. 2 half-twists of grass and a quarter block of manure, broken small, burned fast. The heater face was still warm from the charges before. She pressed both palms to the clay and counted. The mass would hold above freezing for another 6 to 8 hours without fuel, based on the rate of cooling she had observed across 3 days. By then the storm would either break or it would not. She could not make more fuel. She could not leave the barn. She could do only what her father's lesson and Ottilia's teaching and her own split-knuckled labor had built into the wall. Density, patience, and heat that moved slowly through clay because clay refused to let it go. By afternoon, the sky cracked. Not sunshine. That would come tomorrow, but a lightening in the gray, a thinning, a suggestion that somewhere above the overcast a sun still existed. The wind dropped to gusts. The snow stopped driving. The barn was cold on the north side. Ice coated the inside of the walls where drifted snow had melted and refrozen. The roof patch had held but barely. The lean-to had lost 2 boards and the remaining fuel was buried. But the south side, the curtained corner, the clay bench, the 7-foot wall of pale gray blocks that Lydia had dug and shaped and dried and fired and mortared into place with cracked hands and a dead man's lesson. The south side was warm, not comfortable, not cozy, not the warmth of a well-stoked iron stove in a sealed frame house, but warm, warm enough that the water beside the bench was liquid, warm enough that Milo's fever could break instead of deepen, warm enough that a frozen boy could keep his fingers, warm enough that an old man could sleep upright and wake alive, warm enough. When the wind dropped enough to move, Lydia and Ezra dug the barn door clear. The world outside was not a landscape. It was a rearrangement. Drifts 6 feet high ran along fence lines. A dead steer lay frozen against a post with its legs extended, stiff as furniture. The lean-to had lost its north wall entirely, and the remaining fuel stack was buried under 3 feet of packed snow. A wagon tongue from somewhere, not Lydia's property, not anyone she recognized, had been driven like a spear into the ground 30 yards east of the barn. The wind had carried it from God knew where and planted it upright as if marking a claim. Lydia did not stand in the doorway and feel triumph. She stood in the doorway and felt the cold hit her face and understood that the distance between the warmth behind her and the devastation in front of her was 7 feet of clay and the knowledge of two women and the stubbornness of a pig. Then she went back inside and fed the children the last of the cornmeal mush, warmed on the heater face in an iron pot set directly against the clay. News came in pieces over the next 3 days, carried by men on horseback and by neighbors walking fence lines to check who had survived. The Kramer shanty had lost its stovepipe, and the family had spent 2 nights in the root cellar with no heat. The 2 youngest had frostbitten feet. Kramer himself had reached the cattle barn by following his rope, but had stayed there for 30 hours because the rope snapped on the return and he could not find the house. His wife found him in the barn the morning after the storm broke, alive, but with both ears blackened. A bachelor homesteader 7 miles northwest had not been found. His door was open. His stove was cold. His tracks led south from the doorway and vanished within 20 feet. They found him in March when the snow melted 400 yards from his house, face down in a shallow draw he had not been able to see. 2 children at a ranch south of the Smoky Hill had survived because their mother burned every piece of furniture in the house, including the bed frame and the table legs. She ran out of wood at dawn on the 3rd day and was burning the door frame when the wind dropped. The losses were not dramatic in the way of war or fire. They were the quiet arithmetic of cold. A finger here, an ear there, a man who walked the wrong direction, a stovepipe that failed at the joint, a family that ran out of fuel 6 hours before the storm ran out of fury. The January 1886 blizzard killed nearly 100 people across the Central Plains. Most of them died within sight of shelter they could not reach, or inside shelter they could not heat. Lydia had heated hers. Ezra came back 4 days after the storm. He did not come with a verdict. He came with a question. He stood inside the curtained corner of the barn and placed his bare hand flat against the heater wall. The mass was still warm, not from a fresh firing, but from the residual heat of the morning's charge, still radiating 7 hours later through dense clay into the air. He held his hand there for a long time. Lydia waited. She had learned from Attilia that silence after a test was more honest than words during one. "I told you grass would not hold a room," Ezra said. Lydia said nothing. Ezra removed his hand and looked at it, as if the warmth had left a mark. Grass did not. This did. He walked the full length of the heater, running his fingers along the courses. He stopped at the repaired upper seam, the joint Attilia had made Lydia cut out and repack during the curing fires, and traced the line with his thumb. "How much fuel?" he asked. "For the whole storm." Lydia told him. Less than 1 wagon box of substitute fuel, hay twists, manure blocks, sunflower stalks, chips, across 3 days and 2 nights of the worst storm western Kansas had seen in years. Ezra was quiet. He was calculating. He had freighted on the Smoky Hill Trail for 15 years. He knew what a cord of wood cost, what it weighed, how far a man had to haul it. He knew families with iron stoves that had burned through their entire indoor wood supply in the first 36 hours and still froze water in their kettles. "1 wagon box," he said. "Less," Lydia said. He looked at the heater. He looked at the children, both alive, both warm enough to be sitting on the clay bench playing a counting game with pebbles. He looked at Button asleep underneath. "I have been on this plane for 11 winters," Ezra said. "I have seen people do every foolish thing a person can do to stay warm. Burn green wood and fill their lungs with smoke. Seal their houses so tight the stove ate the air and they suffocated in their sleep. Burn buffalo chips in a sheet iron stove that cracked and caught the floor. I have carried people out of houses in the spring who were sitting in their chairs." He paused. "I have not seen this." He did not say it was brilliant. He did not say Lydia was brave. He said what an honest man says when the evidence contradicts his experience. He described what he had not seen. The compliment was in the absence. 11 winters of watching people die from heat they could not hold, and then a woman who held it in clay. Nettie came next. She came without her son. The boy was recovering at home, his blackened fingertips bandaged, the rest of his hand saved by the warmth of the clay bench where Lydia had laid him. Nettie did not mention the fingertips. She did not mention the storm. She walked into the barn, looked at the heater, and said what a practical woman says when a thing she doubted has proven itself. "How thick are the walls?" Lydia told her. 2.5 feet at the firebox, 18 inches at the channels, 12 inches at the upper chamber. "And the channels? How many turns?" "2 full reversals. My house is sod, 20 by 14, 1 room. The stove sits against the east wall and the heat goes straight up the pipe and out the roof. By midnight, the stove is cold unless someone feeds it." "How thick is your east wall?" "Sod, 2 feet. Then you build against it, a smaller mass, 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, 5 feet high. 1 reversal, not 2. The sod wall behind it acts as insulation. The heat goes into the clay, and the clay gives it to the room, and the sod keeps it from going outside." Nettie looked at the heater. She touched the repaired seam. She pressed her palm flat and held it there. "You said I could not eat bricks," Lydia said. "You cannot," Nettie said. "But I was wrong about what bricks could do." She left and came back the next day with measurements of her east wall written on a scrap of paper in pencil. She had already started digging clay from a spot near the creek where the bank had exposed a layer similar to Lydia's seam, not as pure, more sand content, but workable. Within 2 weeks of the storm's end, 4 families had come to Lydia's barn. Not all of them wanted full heaters. Most could not afford the time or the clay, but they wanted something. A man whose fireplace smoked asked if clay liners could seal the throat. A woman whose stove cracked every winter asked if a clay surround could hold the heat the iron lost through the split. A school trustee, the same man who ran the one-room schoolhouse 4 miles south, asked whether a clay mass against the schoolhouse stove wall could keep children warm when the stovepipe failed, because it had failed twice in 3 years, and the last time 12 children sat in a room that dropped below freezing before noon. Lydia answered each question from the marks on her board: the batch numbers, the test results, the shrinkage measurements, the firing times. She did not guard the information. She did not ask for payment. She opened her records the way her father had opened his workshop, as a place where knowledge was traded, not sold. She wrote 3 rules on a flat board and hung it on the barn wall. Dry the mass slowly. 3 days of small fires before a full burn. Burn hot and brief. Do not feed the fire continuously. Let the mass do the work. Never close the damper before the coals are fully dead. Not embers. Ash. The 3rd rule was the one that mattered most. It was the rule that saved lives, and it was the rule that people were most likely to break, because closing the damper felt like holding heat, and holding heat felt like survival. Attilia had made Lydia say it back to her in the dark of the blizzard, and Lydia now made everyone who asked for help say it back to her before she would answer their next question. "The clay is not the dangerous part," Lydia told the school trustee. "The dangerous part is people." Judson Wetherell heard about the storm survivors the way Judson heard everything, late enough that the story had already set, early enough that he could still try to shape what it meant. He did not come to the barn. He sent his attorney. The attorney was a thin man from Hayes named Poole, who wore a town suit and carried a leather case and spoke in the careful grammar of a person who charges by the sentence. He arrived on a Wednesday and asked to see the clay seam. Lydia showed him. Poole looked at the trench. He looked at the blocks drying on planks. He looked at the heater standing against the south wall. He asked questions about the depth of the seam, its extent across the property, and whether Lydia had any documentation of the clay's composition. Lydia understood. "Judson wants the clay," she said. "Mr. Wetherell's position," Poole said, "is that the deed conveyed surface rights for shelter purposes. The mineral content of the subsurface may constitute a separate interest that was not included in the conveyance. He gave me a barn on land he said was worthless. Now the land has value, and he wants it back. Mr. Wetherell's position is more nuanced than that. Mr. Wetherell's position is that I was supposed to fail." Poole closed his case. He had the information he needed. He left without saying whether Judson would file a claim. He did not need to. The threat was the message, and the message was clear. The thing that had saved Lydia's children now had a value that powerful men wanted to control. Lydia stood at the clay trench after Poole left and looked at the pale exposed seam the layer button had found, that Ottilia had taught her to read, that 3 days of blizzard had proven could hold heat when nothing else on the prairie could. She had dug it with her own hands. She had shaped it with cracked knuckles and a dead father's lesson. She had fired it with fuel a neighbor brought out of something between pity and bet. And now a man in a black coat who had never touched the clay wanted to own it because owning things was what he did, and because a woman who should have failed had not. Ottilia and Lydia became something neither of them had words for. Not friends, the age gap and the language gap made friendship too simple a word. Not teacher and student. That relationship had shifted the day Ottilia watched Lydia repair the cracked seam during the blizzard without being told and without panicking. They were collaborators. Two women with overlapping knowledge and different strengths, building a thing neither could have built alone. Through the rest of January and into February, they worked in the barn between storms. Ottilia had the old world stove knowledge, proportions, channel geometry, mortar technique, the instinct for where a mass would crack and where it would hold that came from decades of watching her husband work. Lydia had the testing records, the batch numbers, the mix ratios, the shrinkage data, the firing observations written in pencil on boards and scraps of paper. She had the obsessive precision of an accountant applied to clay, and Ottilia recognized it as the thing that separated a builder from a tinkerer. They improved the design. The first problem was ground moisture. The barn floor was dirt, and dirt in Kansas wicked moisture upward through any porous material set directly on it. The heater's base course had shown damp stains by late January, not structural yet, but a sign of slow damage. They designed a raised clay plinth, a platform of fired blocks set on limestone scraps, lifting the heater's base 4 inches off the floor and creating an air gap that interrupted the moisture path. The second problem was the firebox liner. After 3 months of repeated heating and cooling, the innermost clay blocks, the ones that took the direct flame, had begun to show hairline crazing on their faces. Not failure. Wear. But wear that would become failure in a year or two. They designed the liner blocks to be removable, slightly undersized, set without mortar, held in place by gravity and the surrounding structure. When a liner block crazed beyond use, you pulled it out and slid a new one in. The third problem was cleaning. Ash and soot accumulated in the channels, particularly at the reversal turns where the smoke changed direction. Buildup narrowed the passage, slowed the draft, and eventually would block it. They shaped a clean-out plug at the lowest point of each channel, a clay block sized to fit snugly in an opening, sealed with clay slip, removable with a twist and a pull. A small iron rake, something Lydia did not yet have but sketched on a board with dimensions for a blacksmith, could reach through the clean-out and scrape the channel floor. They argued. They argued about the chimney cap. Attilia wanted fired clay shaped into a rain hood. Lydia wanted scrap tin bent and riveted. Attilia said tin rusted and leaked. Lydia said clay was heavy and could crack in a freeze. They compromised, a clay cap with a tin collar, the tin handling the rain and the clay handling the heat. It was ugly. It worked. They argued about channel width. Attilia wanted 8 inches, the dimension her husband had used in the Volga stoves. Lydia's tests showed that with the dirtier burning prairie fuels, soot accumulated faster in narrow channels, and she wanted 10 inches. They built 2 test sections side by side and burned the same fuel through both for a week. The 10-inch channels stayed cleaner. Attilia looked at Lydia's test records, looked at the channels, and said, "Your father would have been very annoying to work with." "Yes," Lydia said, "he was." These were the best weeks, not the easiest. The cold was still brutal, the food still scarce, the threat from Judson still hanging. But for the first time since Amos's death, Lydia was working with someone whose respect she did not have to earn through argument. Attilia had decided she was competent the day she saw the labeled test tiles and the stacked failures. Everything after that was collaboration between equals who happened to know different things. Attilia told stories while they worked. About Graf, the village on the Volga, where her husband Conrad had built his first stove at 19 for a Russian landlord who wanted his parlor warm without burning through the landlord's birch forest. About the emigration, the trains, the ships, the Kansas railhead where German-speaking families stepped off into wind that had no trees to stop it and land that had no stone to build with. About Conrad's death 3 years earlier, a fall from a scaffold while repairing a church chimney in Liebenthal, and how Attilia had given away his tools because she could not look at them, and how she regretted it every day since. "Except the trowel," Lydia said. "Except the trowel. I kept the trowel because it was small enough to hide from my own grief." The trowel sat on the shelf beside Lydia's first test brick. 2 objects from 2 dead men carried forward by the women who had outlived them. Spring came slow, the way it comes on the Kansas high plain, not as a single thaw, but as a negotiation between cold that refused to leave and warmth that had not yet earned its place. March was mud. April was wind. The grass came back in patches, pale green against brown, and the cattle that had survived began to move north again along the fence lines. Attilia's cough started in March, a dry cough at first, the kind that could be weather or dust or nothing. By April, it was deeper. By May, it sat in her chest the way Milo's cough had sat in his stubborn, wet, unimpressed by remedies. Lydia did not say anything. She watched the way she had watched Milo, listening beneath every conversation for the rattle, the change, the sign that something had shifted from nuisance to danger. Attilia kept working. She came to the barn 3 days a week, sometimes 4, walking the 4 miles from Schoenchen because she would not ask for a ride, and because walking was how she had always moved through a world that did not make special arrangements for old women. She shaped blocks. She mixed mortar. She taught Lydia a technique for smoothing the firebox interior that involved a wet rag and the flat of the trowel, moving in one continuous stroke from top to bottom, pressing the clay surface until it was dense and almost glazed. Conrad called this closing the face, Attilia said. The tighter the surface, the less the smoke bites into it. A closed face lasts twice as long. In June, a summer rain came through, heavy, warm, the kind of rain that Kansas uses to remind its residents that water can be as hostile as cold. Attilia walked home in it because the rain had started after she left the barn, and she refused to wait. The cough worsened after that. By July, she was not walking 4 miles. She was walking 2 miles and resting and walking 2 more. By August, she was coming in Nettie's wagon because Nettie had decided, without being asked, that a woman who had helped save her son's fingers was not going to die on the road between Shonshin and a clay pit. The last teaching was not about clay. Ottilia sat on the bench beside the heater, the bench Milo slept on, the bench that had warmed a frozen boy's hands, and held the stove trowel in her lap. Lydia was packing a new batch of firebox liners, working the clay with the heel of her palm the way Ottilia had shown her months ago. "People will come for the clay," Ottilia said. "More than already have. Men who want to buy it. Men who want to sell it. Men who want to tell you what it is worth." "Judson already has," Lydia said. "Judson is one man. There will be more, and the temptation will be to hold it, to say, 'This is mine. I found it. I built it. I bled for it.'" "I did bleed for it." "You did, and the clay does not care. The clay was here before you, and it will be here after. You found it because a pig was hungry. Do not let them make the clay smaller by making it only yours." Lydia stopped kneading. She looked at Ottilia, the white hair under the dark scarf, the hands that had shaped more masonry than Lydia would shape in a lifetime, the cough that sat in her chest now like a second heartbeat, always there, always counting. "I will not," Lydia said. Ottilia left the trowel on the shelf when she went home that evening. She did not say she was leaving it. She set it beside the test brick and walked out. And Lydia understood that the placement was a sentence Ottilia had chosen not to speak aloud. Ottilia Rohr died in September of 1886, 1 year after Amos Wetherell's mule had kicked the first domino. She died in her bed in Shonshin with her daughter beside her, and her hands folded over the quilt and her cough finally quiet. Lydia learned about it from Nettie, who came to the barn with the news and a loaf of dark bread and the particular steadiness of a woman who has carried grief before and knows the weight. Lydia did not cry in front of the children. She went to the clay trench, alone, and stood where Ottilia had stood the first day, at the edge, looking down at the pale seam. She picked up a piece of raw clay, broke it, smelled the broken edge, rubbed it between her thumb and forefinger. She set it down. The absence was not empty. It was full of everything Ottilia had placed in it. The techniques, the arguments, the stories of Graf and Conrad, and a stove built for a Russian landlord, the flat of the trowel closing the face of a firebox, the voice in the dark of a blizzard saying, "Feel the sound, not fear it." Lydia went back into the barn and picked up the trowel and began smoothing a firebox liner with one continuous stroke, top to bottom, the way she had been taught. The secondary crisis came in November of 1886, 9 months after the blizzard and 6 weeks after Ottilia's death. Lydia was not ready. She said so to Nettie, who had come to help move a finished batch of bench blocks to a neighbor's sod house. She said, "Ottilia built stoves for 40 years. I have built one heater and improved it for 8 months. I'm not her." "You do not need to be her," Nettie said. "You need to be you with her teaching." The schoolhouse stove cracked during a sleet storm on a Tuesday, not the firebox. The stove body itself, a seam along the side plate where years of heating and cooling had fatigued the cast iron until it split. Smoke poured into the single room where 12 children sat on benches with their coats on because the stove had not been drawing well for a week and the room was already cold. The teacher, a young woman from Topeka who had been on the plains for 14 months and feared winter the way some people fear snakes, sent the oldest boy to ride for help. He reached Lydia's barn in 40 minutes, horse-lathered and his own hands red with cold. 12 children. Judson Wetherell's grandson among them, A cracked stove, sleet building on the roof, temperature dropping, no repair possible for the cast iron without a foundry, and the nearest foundry was in Hayes, and would not send a man out in a sleet storm for a schoolhouse. Lydia loaded the wagon. She took pre-dried clay slabs, 24 of them, cut and fired for this purpose, stored in the barn since September. She took the stove trowel. She took a bucket of clay slip. She took the iron rake she had finally gotten made by a blacksmith in town, small enough to reach into a channel, strong enough to scrape hard soot. She did not take Ottilia. Ottilia was in the ground in Shoenshin. This was the moment Ottilia had prepared her for, without ever saying so. The moment when the teaching had to become the teacher, and the woman who had been taught had to stand where the woman who taught had stood. Ruth came. She was 8 now, and she carried the tally board. They reached the schoolhouse in an hour. The children were in the lee corner, as far from the smoking stove as the room allowed, huddled in a mass of coats and scarves, and the particular silence of children who are frightened and have been told to be calm. The teacher stood near the stove with a rag over her mouth, trying to cover the crack with a piece of sheet metal she had found somewhere, accomplishing nothing except burning her hands on the hot iron. Lydia did not comfort the children. She assessed. The stove crack ran 8 inches along the side plate. It could not be sealed with clay. The iron expanded and contracted too much, and any rigid patch would pop off within hours. But the stove did not need to be sealed. It needed to be surrounded. If she built a clay shield around the cracked section, a freestanding wall of pre-dried clay slabs, set against the iron but not mortared to it, leaving a half-inch gap for expansion, the shield would catch the leaking smoke and redirect it upward toward the stovepipe. It was not a repair. It was a containment. She had the slabs. She had the slip for jointing the slabs to each other. She had the rake for cleaning the stovepipe where soot had built up and contributed to the poor draw. She did not have time to dry a new structure. The slabs were already fired. She could build dry. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Lydia built the shield in 2 hours. Ruth held the slabs while Lydia jointed them, working the slip into the seams with the flat of the trowel, one continuous stroke top to bottom, closing the face. She raked the stovepipe and cleared a fist-sized clot of soot from the elbow joint that had been choking the draft for months. She relit the stove with the shield in place and watched. Smoke leaked from the crack, hit the clay shield, rose along its face, and was pulled upward by the restored draft. The room began to clear. Within 30 minutes, the air was clean enough that the teacher removed the rag from her mouth. Within an hour, the clay shield was warm, not from direct fire, but from the radiant heat of the iron stove beside it, storing energy the same way the barn heater stored energy, the same principle scaled down and applied fast. The children moved back to their benches. One of them, a boy of 9 with red ears and a runny nose, pressed his palms to the warm clay shield the way Ruth pressed her palms to the heater at home. Judson Wetherell's grandson was sitting on the bench nearest the stove. He was 6 years old, and he had his grandfather's jaw and his grandmother's silence. He watched Lydia work with the expression of a child who does not understand what an adult is doing, but recognizes that it matters. He did not tell his grandfather what he had seen. He did not need to. By evening, 3 families had told the story of the woman who came to the schoolhouse with a wagon load of clay and fixed what the town could not. By morning, the story had reached Judson's kitchen table, carried by the same gossip network that had once carried the word crazy. The word that traveled now was different. Not crazy, not brave. The word was useful. And on the Kansas frontier in 1886, useful was the highest currency there was. Lydia stood in the schoolhouse that evening after the children had gone home, running her hand along the clay shield she had built around the cracked stove. The sleet had stopped. The temperature was dropping towards single digits. The shield was warm. She thought about Ottilia's hands in the flour, drawing smoke channels. She thought about her father's palm on a warm stone wall. She thought about a pig rooting in clay he could not eat, and a woman kneeling beside him because she had nothing left to try except the thing no one believed in. The trowel was in her hand. Conrad Rohr's trowel, carried from the Volga to Kansas, passed from a dead husband to a living wife, to a woman who was neither family nor student, but something the language had not yet named. Lydia turned it in the schoolhouse lamplight and saw the wear on the blade. Decades of mortar, decades of smoothing, decades of closing the face awe, and understood that the tool had outlived its maker and its keeper, and was now hers, not because she deserved it, but because she was willing to use it. She locked the schoolhouse door and drove the wagon home through the dark with Ruth asleep against her shoulder and the trowel in her coat pocket, warm from her hand. By the spring of 1887, Lydia's barn had become something it was never intended to be. Judson Wetherill had deeded it as a killing ground, a structure designed to look like charity while functioning as a slow removal of a woman he wanted gone. 2 winters later, the barn was the center of a clay operation that served 11 families within a day's ride of Hayes, and the woman Judson had tried to remove was the one people rode to when their stoves failed. The work had a rhythm now. Spring was digging. Lydia opened the clay trench wider, cutting a second bench into the seam so 2 people could work at different depths. She sorted clay by grade the way Ottilia had taught her. Firebox grade from the deepest, densest layer, channel grade from the middle, reject for grinding into grog. Ruth kept the tally board. She had developed a system of marks that tracked not just quantities, but qualities. A circle for firebox grade, a line for channel grade, an X for reject. She was 9 years old, and she ran the inventory with the precision of a freight office clerk. Summer was molding. The clay dried fastest in the July heat, when the Kansas wind pulled moisture from the blocks in hours instead of days. Lydia and Nettie's family worked together. Nettie's oldest son, the one whose fingertips had been saved by the heater bench, carried raw clay from the trench to the mixing box. Nettie's daughter packed molds. Nettie herself kneaded batches with the heel of her palm, complaining the entire time about mud under her nails and sore shoulders and the smell of grog dust, and coming back every morning because the work was necessary and because Nettie had learned that standing beside Lydia during the storm season was safer than standing anywhere else. Autumn was drying and firing. The blocks cured on planks arranged in rows that covered the south side of the barn's yard, each row labeled with Ruth's marks. Lydia inspected every batch the way Ottilia had inspected hers, tapping, listening, feeling the break edge. She rejected more than she accepted. The families who came for blocks learned quickly that Lydia's standards were not negotiable. "This one has a void," Lydia would say, holding up a block that looked solid to the untrained eye. "It looks fine." Tap it. Hear the difference? That hollow sound means air trapped inside. Air trapped inside means steam when it heats. Steam means a crack you will not see until smoke comes through it at midnight in January. The block went into the reject pile. The reject pile went into the grinder. Nothing was wasted. Winter was repair and installation. Families who had built heaters or lined their stoves the previous year came back with problems: a cracked liner, a clogged channel, a chimney that leaked at the roof line where rain had softened the clay mortar. Lydia loaded the wagon with replacement blocks, the iron rake, the trowel, and a bucket of fresh slip, and she drove to their homes and fixed what needed fixing and taught them how to fix it themselves next time. She did not charge money for the teaching. She charged labor. Every family that wanted blocks from the seam had to dig, mold, or haul. Every family that wanted installation help had to provide a second pair of hands. The rule was not generosity, it was engineering. Lydia had learned from the schoolhouse crisis that a heater built by one person was a heater only one person could repair, and when that person was unavailable, children froze. The knowledge had to spread, or it was useless. The first community build happened in March of 1887 at the sod house of a German-Russian family named Pfannenstiel, 3 miles east of Munjor. 14 people came, Nettie's family. 2 men who had mocked Lydia at the dry goods store the previous autumn. A woman whose husband had died in the blizzard, not from cold but from a fall while trying to repair his stovepipe in the wind. A teenage boy who had walked 6 miles because he wanted to learn a trade and did not know what trade this was, but had heard the clay woman needed hands. Lydia drew the plan on a board the way Ottilia had drawn the smoke channels in flour. She assigned tasks. She supervised the foundation. She corrected the mortar mix when one of the men added too much water. She climbed the ladder and shaped the chimney throat herself, because the angle mattered, and she was not yet willing to trust it to anyone else's hands. One of the men who had mocked her, the one who had said she was building a tomb with a chimney, knelt in the mud beside the heater foundation and smoothed clay for the base course. He did not speak to Lydia. He did not apologize. He worked with the careful attention of a man who has realized that the thing he laughed at is the thing that might keep his mother warm, and that realization is its own apology, more honest than words. Lydia watched him work. She did not comment. She did not say, "I remember what you said." She said, "Press harder at the edges. The center will hold itself, but the edges want to lift." He pressed harder. Ruth stood at the edge of the build site with her tally board and counted blocks used, blocks cracked, hours worked. She was keeping records the way Lydia kept records, and the way Lydia's father had kept records, not from habit, but from the understanding that measurement was respect, and respect for the work was what separated a building from a pile. Judson Wetherell's attorney filed the mineral rights claim in April of 1887. The claim argued that the original deed conveyed surface shelter rights only, and that subsurface mineral deposits, including clay of commercial value, constituted a separate interest retained by the grantor. It was legally dubious. The deed language was standard homestead conveyance with no mineral reservation clause. But Judson did not need to win. He needed to threaten. A court case cost money Lydia did not have. A court case took time Lydia could not spare. A court case created uncertainty that made every family who depended on the clay nervous about building with a material whose ownership might change. Lydia could not afford a lawyer. She could barely afford nails. Ezra Tillman solved it without intending to. He had been talking, in the way old men talk, at the feed store, at the post office, at the blacksmith's shop where he waited for a harness ring. He talked about the blizzard. He talked about the heater. He talked about the fuel math, 1 wagon box of substitute fuel against 3 days of the worst storm in a decade. He talked about Nettie's son's fingers and the schoolhouse stove and the families lining up for clay blocks. He did not talk about Judson's claim. He did not need to. The story did the work. A Hayes newspaper correspondent, a young man who filed dispatches for a Topeka paper, heard the story and wrote it up, not as drama, as economy. The piece focused on fuel savings, how many cords of wood a masonry mass replaced, how much money a family saved per winter, how the clay was local and free and the labor was shared. The piece mentioned Judson's claim in one sentence, identifying him as the man who had deeded the land and was now contesting the clay. The Topeka readership did not care about Lydia. They cared about fuel costs. Western Kansas settlement was stalling because heating was too expensive for poor families on treeless land. And here was a method that used local clay and substitute fuel to survive conditions that killed people with conventional stoves. Judson dropped the claim in May. He did not announce it. Poole, the attorney, simply did not file the next motion. The case died on the docket the way embarrassing things die, quietly, without a body, leaving only the smell. But Judson was not finished. He was merely repositioning. The confrontation Lydia had been expecting came in November of 1887, during the first hard cold of the season. Judson's townhouse had a brick chimney that had served him for 9 years. The chimney's flue liner, common fired brick, not refractory grès had cracked during the previous winter's freeze-thaw cycle, and the crack had widened through the summer's heat until the November cold opened it fully. Smoke backed into the upstairs rooms. The stove draw failed. The house that Judson had built to demonstrate his permanence and his prosperity was suddenly, in the first week of real cold, uninhabitable without repair. He did not come himself. He sent Almeida's servant, a young German-Russian woman named Katrin, who worked in the Wetherill kitchen and was embarrassed to be standing in Lydia's barn, asking for clay liners on behalf of the man who had tried to steal the clay. Lydia did not make Katrin wait. She did not make Katrin explain. She wrapped 8 firebox grade liner blocks in burlap, loaded them on Katrin's cart, and sent Ruth with a note. The note said, "For the children in that house," 4 words. They carried the weight of every word Judson had spoken and every threat he had made. The liners were for Judson's grandchildren, including the boy who had sat in the schoolhouse and watched Lydia build the shield. The gift was not forgiveness. It was a statement of position. Lydia's clay served children, all children, including the children of the man who had tried to take it from her. Judson came to the barn 3 days later. He came alone. No attorney, no Almeida, no black coat. He wore a work jacket, which Lydia noticed because she had never seen him in anything that could get dirty. He stood at the barn door and looked at the operation. The clay trench, the drying planks, the stacked blocks, the tally board, the women and men working in the November cold with split knuckles and pencil marks, and the steady efficiency of people who knew what they were doing. "Name your price," Judson said. He said it the way he said everything, as a transaction, a deal, an exchange that could be resolved with money because money was the language he spoke and the only language he believed was real. Lydia was kneading a batch of channel-grade clay in the mixing box. She did not stop working. She did not look up. "The same as everyone else," she said. "Work first, then blocks." "I'm not going to dig clay." "Then you are not going to have blocks." Ezra was there. Nettie was there. 2 of the men from the community build were there. The teenage boy who had walked 6 miles in March was there, now a competent block molder who could produce 40 in a day. They all heard the exchange. They all watched Judson Wetherill stand in the doorway of the barn he had given to a woman he expected to fail, and reckon with the fact that the woman had not failed, and the barn was no longer his, and the clay was no longer his, and the only way to get what he needed was to do what everyone else did. He removed his gloves. He walked to the mixing box. He looked at the clay the way a man looks at mud, which is what it was and which is what it was not. Lydia moved aside to give him room. She did not instruct him. She did not gloat. She put a lump of raw clay in front of him and said, "Heel of the palm, fold, press, turn." Judson Wetherill knelt in the clay. It was not redemption. It was not sentimental. It was a man who had run out of options, discovering that the option he had tried to destroy was the only one that worked, and that the woman he had tried to break was the one person willing to help him if he would do the one thing he had never done: put his hands in the dirt. He worked for 4 hours. He produced 11 usable blocks and 6 rejects. His hands were raw. His knees were muddy. His coat was ruined. Lydia gave him 12 liner blocks, 8 for his chimney and 4 spare. She gave them to him the way she gave them to everyone, counted, inspected, wrapped in burlap, with the 3 rules recited back to her before they left her hands. Never close the damper before the coals are fully dead, Judson said, repeating the words. Not embers, Lydia said, ash. He left. He did not thank her. He did not apologize for the attorney, the mineral claim, the deed, the rail ticket, the word "I crazy," or the barn he had given her as a death sentence. He carried 12 blocks of clay to his wagon and drove back to town. Nettie watched him go and said, "That must have felt good." Lydia looked at her raw hands. It felt like Tuesday. Calvin Sowers arrived in the spring of 1888, not as a suitor, but as a problem solver. He was 36, widowed 2 years, a blacksmith and wagon repairer who had moved from Abilene to Hayes when the cattle trade shifted. He was built the way blacksmiths are built, wide through the chest and forearms, narrow through the patience. He spoke in short sentences and listened in long silences, and he had heard about the clay heaters from 3 different customers before he decided to see the operation himself. He came to the barn because a neighbor had asked him to make a hinge strap for a clean-out door, and Calvin did not like making things for purposes he did not understand. He wanted to see the door. He wanted to see the heater. He wanted to understand what the hinge was for before he shaped the iron. Lydia showed him. He looked at the clean-out plug. He looked at the iron rake. He looked at the channel behind the plug, the soot on the walls, the angle of the turn. He got on his knees and put his head into the opening and looked up into the first rising channel the way a man looks up a chimney with the professional curiosity of someone who understands heat and metal and the damage they do to each other. "The rake is too long," he said. "It reaches the back wall. It reaches the back wall and it scrapes the side walls on the way. Your channels are 10 inches wide. The rake head is 8. It binds at the turns. You need a rake head that pivots." He was right. Lydia had been fighting the rake at the turns for months, angling it sideways and losing soot that fell back into the channel. A pivoting head, hinged at the shaft, free to angle with the passage, would follow the turns instead of fighting them. "Can you make one?" Lydia asked. "I can make one. What else do you need?" He made the rake. He made hinge straps for the clean-out doors, proper straps, not the bent wire improvisation Lydia had been using. He made a small iron frame for the firebox opening that protected the clay edge from chipping when fuel was loaded. He made a chimney cap bracket that held the clay cap without relying on mortar alone. He came back. He came back again. He came back a 3rd time with a tool he had designed without being asked. A small iron trowel, similar in size to Conrad Rohr's, but with a slightly curved blade that followed the inside of a flue throat better than a flat one. "For the tight turns," he said. Lydia held it. She held Conrad's trowel in the other hand. The old trowel was flat, the new one curved. Together they covered every surface a builder would meet inside a masonry heater. "You did not have to make this," Lydia said. "No," Calvin said. He did not explain. He did not need to. The trowel was the sentence. Courtship on the Kansas frontier did not look like courtship anywhere else. There were no dances for a widow with clay under her nails and 2 children and a pig. There were no Sunday calls with pressed shirts and nervous conversation. There was work. Calvin repaired Lydia's wagon tongue, which had cracked at the bolster. Lydia mended Calvin's forge apron, which had burned through at the shoulder. Calvin built a proper door for the barn, a real door, hung on iron hinges that closed against the wind and latched from inside. Lydia showed Calvin how to test clay by the break, the fracture that looked like a torn page, not a snapped bone. They argued about the chimney cap. Lydia still preferred the clay and tin compromise she and Ottilia had designed. Calvin said the tin collar weakened the joint and offered to forge a cast iron collar that would outlast both of them. They argued for 3 days and built both versions and tested them side by side through a rainstorm, and Calvin's version leaked less. Lydia admitted it. Calvin did not mention it again, which was how Lydia knew he was serious about her, because a man who wins an argument and does not revisit it is a man who values the person more than the victory. Ruth approved of Calvin the day he asked to see her tally board and studied it with the same attention he gave to his own forge records. He asked her what the circle meant, and she told him, and he asked what the X meant, and she told him, and he said, "You have a system," and Ruth said, "Yes," and that was enough. Milo approved of Calvin because Calvin did not try to replace his father. Milo did not remember his father clearly. He had been 4 when Amos died, and 4-year-old memories are impressions, not photographs. Calvin treated Milo the way he treated all children, with the expectation that they would be useful and the patience to show them how. He taught Milo to pump the bellows at the forge. He taught him to recognize iron by color when it was ready to bend. He did not teach him to call him anything but Calvin. They married in 1889 in the Hayes courthouse, with Ezra and Nettie as witnesses, and Ruth holding the tally board because she had nowhere else to put it and would not leave it in the wagon. Button bit Judson Wetherill at the reception. Through the trouser cuff. Lydia apologized. She did not mean it. Neither, she suspected, did the pig. The operation grew the way useful things grow on the frontier, not by ambition, but by need. Lydia and Calvin added a second drying shed. They widened the clay trench to a proper pit with shored walls and a drainage channel. Calvin built iron tools for every stage of the process: cutting blades, mold clamps, a channel scraper with 3 interchangeable heads, a firebox probe for testing heat penetration. Ruth designed a labeling system for finished blocks that included grade, batch date, firing temperature estimate, and destination family. She was 12 when she designed it, and it was better than anything Lydia had used. The blocks became known across the German, Russian, and Anglo settlements within 50 miles as Rohr Wetherill heater blocks. Ottilia's name first, always. Because Lydia insisted, and because the name carried the weight of the knowledge's origin. Not every family built a full heater. Most could not afford the time or the mass. But firebox liners, clay benches, stove surrounds, safer flue repairs, and chimney patches spread through the settlements the way any practical technology spreads. Slowly, by demonstration, family by family, winter by winter. Lydia did not become wealthy. She became useful, and on the treeless Kansas plain, where a January storm could kill a man between his door and his barn, useful was the thing that kept you alive and the thing that made your neighbors knock before the storm instead of after. She and Calvin raised Ruth and Milo and 2 more children, a boy and a girl born in 1890 and 1892. The boy was named Conrad, after a man he would never meet whose trowel he would one day carry. The girl was named Beret, after no one in particular, because Lydia wanted at least one child whose name was entirely her own. Milo survived childhood. His cough came back every autumn like an old acquaintance with bad timing, but it never again reached the wet rattle of the blizzard night. He grew tall and quiet, and at 16 he drove a freight wagon carrying clay liner blocks to settlements as far south as Dodge City. And he told the story of the heater to anyone who would listen, not because his mother asked, but because the story was true, and true stories on the frontier were a kind of currency. Ruth became the best measurer in the clay yard. She could judge a block's grade by tapping it with a spoon handle the way Ottilia had, and she could estimate shrinkage within a 1/16 of an inch by feel. When she was 15, she kept the accounts for the entire operation: clay dug, blocks molded, blocks fired, blocks sold, blocks given, labor traded. The ledger was clean and precise, and Calvin said it was better than any account book he had seen in Abilene, and Ruth said, "It should be. I have been keeping records since I was 7." Button grew old and mean. He slept under the clay bench in winter and under the drying planks in summer, and he bit anyone who came too close to the clay trench without Lydia's permission, which meant he bit Judson Wetherell twice more over the years, once at a community build and once at a church supper where Button had no business being but had followed Milo through the door. He died in 1894 in his sleep, under the bench, in the heat of the clay he had found. Lydia buried him behind the barn, beside the trench, and Ruth marked the grave with a fired clay tile stamped with a single circle, firebox grade, the best they had. Within 5 winters of the blizzard, more than 30 families had some version of Lydia and Ottilia's clay work in their homes. Not all were grand heaters. Most were firebox liners, heat benches, stove surrounds, and clay-lined flues. The schoolhouse kept a small repaired masonry mass near the stove wall where the clay shield had stood. Children warmed their hands there before lessons, pressing their palms flat against the clay the way Ruth had taught them, feeling for the heat the way you feel for a pulse. Lydia lived out her later years on the land meant to drive her away. The barn was rebuilt around the heater rather than the heater removed from the barn. The walls went up new in 1891, proper frame construction with Calvin's iron hardware, and the clay mass stood at the center like a heart the house had grown around. She kept the first cracked test brick on her kitchen shelf beside the stove trowel. When she died in 1921, Ruth kept both, the brick and the trowel, and the deed with the cracked seal, in a box lined with the quilt Lydia had carried from Ohio. In the Hayes Land Office, 61 years after Almeda Wetherell slid a deed across the counter and said, "Shelter enough, if she is as stubborn as she claims." Winter light fell through the repaired barn window onto a clay wall still warm after the fire had gone dark. Behind the barn, a pig's old rooting scar sat half-filled with grass where the trench had been. And Ruth's child, a girl of 4, the age Milo had been the year the world tried to freeze him, stood on the clay bench and pressed both palms flat against the heater, the way Lydia once pressed hers to a test brick in the October wind, feeling for something she could not name, finding it warm. They had given her a barn because they thought nothing living could stay warm inside it. They had not known the ground underneath was waiting,